A haunting guitar melody shattered the heavy silence that blanketed the house in the quiet suburbs of Los Angeles. Jake froze mid-step on the staircase, his ears caught by the strange and unfamiliar tune. It wasn't the kind of music he usually heard. It wasn't cheerful or steady. Instead, it was heavy, fragmented, like a muffled cry hidden in every note. His eyes instinctively turned toward the upstairs, toward the room where the music was coming from. Emily. Just the name stirred something restless inside Jake. She had moved in yesterday, bringing with her an entirely different energy that disrupted the predictable rhythm of the house. Jake couldn't shake the memory of her arrival, the way she had stepped out of that sleek, expensive car with an air of cold indifference. Her gaze was sharp and unapologetic, making Jake feel invisible in his own home. She had glanced at him only once, a fleeting, almost dismissive look, before walking off as if he wasn't worth a second thought. But now, the music Emily was playing seemed to pull him into another world. Jake began climbing the stairs cautiously, his footsteps deliberately light, as though afraid the sound would vanish if he moved too quickly. The closer he got to Emily's room, the louder the melody grew, swelling with raw emotion. Just as he reached the door, the music stopped abruptly. In that moment, the house felt frozen, as if it were holding its breath. Jake stood there, motionless, ready to stay there all night if he had to. Her voice cut through the stillness, smooth and dripping with sarcasm. Jake flinched. The door swung open, and there she was, Emily, standing in the doorway, her piercing blue eyes glowing under the soft light of her room. Her brown hair fell carelessly over her shoulders, and she wore an oversized band t-shirt that Jake didn't recognize, the kind that amplified her effortless, untamed style. But it was her gaze that truly unsettled him. Cold, sharp, and cutting, as if it could slice right through him. "I wasn't eavesdropping," Jake blurted, feeling heat rise to his face. "It's just, your guitar. Sounds nice." Emily raised an eyebrow, her lips curving into a smile devoid of warmth. "Nice? That's not exactly high praise for my music, but thanks, I guess." She tilted her head slightly, studying him like a puzzle she had no interest in solving. "Jake, right? The quiet guy who lives here." Jake pressed his lips together, feeling the sting of her words but choosing not to react. He was never great with quick comebacks, especially not with someone like Emily, who exuded a confidence so intense it made others shrink. "Yeah, I'm Jake," he mumbled, barely audible. Emily crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe. "Interesting. I didn't peg you as someone who'd care about music. You seem pretty closed off." Her words were like a needle piercing his pride, but Jake managed to keep his composure. "I'm just curious. Your music feels emotional." For a brief moment, something softened in Emily's eyes, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Emotional? Maybe. But emotions aren't something I like to share with just anyone." With that, she turned away, stepping back into her room and shutting the door before Jake could say anything else. Moments later, the sound of her guitar filled the air again. This time, the melody was more intense, stormy, almost like a tempest had been unleashed. Jake stood there, rooted to the spot, his mind buzzing with questions. Why did she seem so burdened? How could someone who radiated such strength create music that sounded so broken? Eventually, he retreated to his room, but the sound of Emily's guitar lingered in his mind long after he closed the door. It was like a whisper in the dark, a piece of a puzzle he didn't know how to solve. And though he wouldn't admit it, Emily had awakened something in him, something he wasn't ready to name. Was it curiosity? Or perhaps something deeper? Something closer to longing? What Jake didn't know was that Emily's guitar wasn't just music. It was a prelude, a quiet warning of the complex and dangerous emotions about to unravel, pulling them both into a storm neither could escape. That night, Jake couldn't sleep. Emily's guitar echoed in his mind, as if each note had etched itself into his memory. Lying in bed, he stared at the ceiling, his chest heavy with an inexplicable restlessness. There was something about Emily he couldn't quite grasp, not just the way she entered the house with defiant confidence, but the way her music resonated. It wasn't just intense, it was haunting. It carried a cry for help, hidden beneath each lingering chord. The next morning, Jake came downstairs earlier than usual. To his surprise, Emily was already there, sitting at the table with a coffee cup in front of her. She said nothing, her fingers lightly tapping the table in rhythm to an imaginary beat, her gaze fixed on the window. For the first time, Jake noticed something different about her. Gone was her usual air of indifference. In the soft morning light, her face betrayed a quiet sadness he couldn't quite place. "Morning," Jake greeted, breaking the silence. Emily turned to look at him, her piercing blue eyes locking onto his. "Morning," she replied curtly, her voice hoarse, as if carrying the weight of a sleepless night. Jake slid into the seat across from her, gripping his coffee cup as though anchoring himself. The silence between them wasn't hostile, but it was thick with unspoken thoughts. Finally, he broke it, his tone gentle but tinged with curiosity. "Your guitar last night, it was good." Emily let out a laugh, but it wasn't filled with joy. "Good? I don't think you really get it." Jake frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Emily took a sip of her coffee, her gaze briefly meeting his before drifting somewhere far away. "My music isn't for fun. It's how I escape. But no matter how much I play, reality's always there waiting for me." Jake didn't know how to respond. He felt the weight of her words, the raw honesty behind them. There was something simmering beneath her surface, something trapped, something she couldn't free. But before he could ask more, Emily set her coffee down and leaned back in her chair. "Do you ever feel like you don't belong anywhere?" she asked, her voice low yet sharp, like a blade cutting through his thoughts. Jake froze. The question struck the deepest part of him, pulling at things he'd never shared with anyone. "Yeah," he admitted quietly. "All the time." Emily smirked, but it wasn't mocking. It was tired, as though resigned to a truth they both understood too well. "Well, at least we have that in common." She stood up, taking her empty coffee cup to the sink. Jake watched her move, her confidence masking a loneliness he could feel but not fully comprehend. For a moment he hesitated, unsure if he should say something, but he couldn't stop himself. "Why do you feel that way?" he asked. Emily froze mid-motion, her hand clutching the cup. She didn't turn to face him, but her voice cut through the air, cold and bitter. "Because this place, this house, this life, it's all an arrangement. My mom didn't marry your dad for love. She married him because she needed stability, someone who could carry the weight she couldn't. And me? I'm just the baggage she brought along." Jake felt his throat tighten. He hadn't expected her to be so blunt, to strip away the polite facade of their blended family with such brutal honesty. Her words shattered the carefully constructed image of harmony his father had tried so hard to create. Emily turned back to him, and for the first time, her sharp gaze softened into something hollow, something vulnerable. "Do you ever feel like you're just a piece in someone else's game?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Jake didn't answer. He didn't need to. Emily nodded slightly, as if she already understood, and then she walked out of the kitchen, leaving Jake alone with a storm of emotions raging inside him. After she left, Jake stared out the window, where the morning sunlight spilled over the backyard. In his chest, a question lingered. Who was Emily, really? And why did he feel such an irresistible pull to understand her, as though discovering her truth was something he couldn't avoid? Jake didn't know it at the time, but this was just the beginning of a connection neither of them could have anticipated. That evening, the house was eerily quiet. Jake sat on the living room couch, staring at the television, though his mind was elsewhere. His father and stepmother had gone out to dinner, leaving the house empty except for him and Emily. Jake was used to nights like this. His father was always busy, and his stepmother rarely stayed in one place for long. But Emily's presence made everything feel different, charged with an inexplicable tension Jake couldn't quite place. He heard her descending the stairs, each step slow and deliberate, as if she were carefully measuring every move. Jake didn't turn around, but he could feel her enter the room. When she sat down in the chair across from him, he couldn't help but glance at her. Her brown hair fell loosely over her shoulders, her legs were crossed, and she held a glass of red wine in one hand. Emily seemed like she belonged to a world far removed from his, distant, untouchable. "Do you always watch TV like this?" "It looks painfully boring," she said, her tone teasing but with an undercurrent Jake couldn't quite identify. Jake shrugged, trying to appear indifferent. "Just passing the time." Emily smirked, though the smile didn't reach her eyes. She took a sip of her wine, her gaze drifting from the TV back to Jake. "Passing the time? How fascinating. Don't you have anything better to do?" Jake sensed the provocation in her words but chose to remain silent. He didn't want to admit how unsettled her presence made him, but his silence seemed to amuse her, encouraging her to press further. "Are you always like this?" she asked, tilting her head and narrowing her eyes as if studying him. "Always hiding from everything?" Jake frowned, finally turning to face her. "And you? Do you always try to provoke people?" Emily laughed, this time more genuinely. She set her wine glass down on the coffee table, leaning back in the chair with her arms crossed. "Maybe. But at least I'm not pretending to be something I'm not." They fell into silence. Not a comfortable one, but one thick with tension, like a taut string ready to snap. Jake tried to focus on the television, but Emily's gaze burned into him, consuming everything in its path. He couldn't take it anymore. "What do you really want?" Jake asked, his voice low but steady. Emily leaned forward slightly, her eyes glinting with something indecipherable. "I don't want anything. I'm just curious about you." "About me?" Jake scoffed lightly. "What could possibly be interesting about me?" Emily didn't answer right away. She studied him, her gaze piercing through the layers he had spent years building to protect himself. "Maybe it's because you're always hiding. It makes me want to figure out who you really are." Jake felt his chest tighten. He wasn't used to someone looking at him like that, so directly, so intensely. He didn't know how to respond, but before he could try, Emily stood up, picking up her wine glass. "Don't worry," she said, her voice soft but with a hint of challenge. "I don't expect you to answer." She walked out of the room, leaving Jake there, overwhelmed and confused. He didn't know what to do, but a part of him couldn't let her just leave like that. Almost instinctively, he got up and followed her to the backyard. She stood under the faint glow of the patio light, her wine glass in hand, her gaze fixed on the dark sky. Jake stopped a few steps behind her, unsure of what to say or do but unable to retreat. "Why did you follow me out here?" she asked, her voice softer this time, tinged with a tenderness that caught him off guard. Jake hesitated, the words caught in his throat. "I don't know." Emily turned to face him, her blue eyes shimmering under the dim light. "You don't know? That's strange. I thought you always knew what you wanted." Jake let out a dry laugh. "And you? Do you always know what you want?" Emily took a step closer, and Jake could feel her presence, strong, almost overwhelming, as if it enveloped him and left him unable to move. "Maybe I do. Or maybe I'm just trying to figure it out." Jake didn't respond. They stood there, locked in each other's gaze, in a moment that felt profoundly significant. He didn't know who moved first, but before he realized it, Emily was so close he could feel her breath on his skin. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Have you ever thought that some things, even if they're wrong, are worth trying?" Jake didn't reply. He couldn't. Before he could process what was happening, Emily leaned in and brushed her lips against his in a kiss so light, so fleeting, yet it ignited something deep within him that he couldn't deny. It wasn't a long kiss, but it was enough to change everything. "I saw you last night with Emily." Jake froze. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. "What the hell are you thinking, Jake?" Ryan continued, his voice rising. "She's your stepsister, she's family. And you kissed her? How could you do this?" Jake felt cornered. "Ryan, it's not as simple as you think," he said, his voice weak. "Not simple." Ryan let out a bitter laugh. "Then explain it to me. How does something like this happen? Did you even think about your dad? About your family? You think I don't know all of that?" Jake shouted, his voice breaking as he lost control for the first time. "I know, Ryan. I know this is wrong. I know how bad it is, but I can't stop. I can't stop." Ryan stood silent for a moment, his anger slowly giving way to something deeper, disappointment. "Jake," he said quietly, his voice strained, "this isn't just about you and Emily. This is going to destroy your family. And if you don't stop, I can't promise to keep this to myself." Jake stood there, watching as Ryan turned and walked away, leaving him alone with the crushing weight of his words. Jake knew Ryan was right, but the one thing he didn't know was how to let Emily go. Every time he saw her, he felt like he couldn't breathe without her. The house had never felt so cold. The walls, once alive with the warmth of everyday family conversations, now echoed only with the ticking of the clock and a silence that felt oppressive. Jake sat on the edge of his bed, his hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. The confrontation with Ryan from the day before replayed endlessly in his mind, like a broken record stuck on its most painful refrain. He knew everything was spiraling toward an inevitable conclusion, but what would that conclusion be? Emily, the one person who made him feel truly alive, was also the one pulling him into a vortex of torment. Ryan, his best friend, now looked at him with disappointment and betrayal. And above all, there was his father, the man who had always expected Jake to be good, to do what was right. It was as if all of it, the weight of everyone's expectations and the mess he had created, was crushing him, leaving him unable to breathe. A soft knock broke the stillness. Jake looked up, and his heart stopped when he saw Emily standing in the doorway. She wore a loose sweater and jeans, her simple attire only amplifying the beauty that made it impossible for him to look away. For the first time, her piercing blue eyes lacked their usual sharpness or defiance. Instead, they held a sadness so deep it felt like it could swallow him whole. "We need to talk," Emily said, her voice quiet but firm. Jake nodded and Emily stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. She sat beside him on the bed, her hands clasped together as if she were trying to steady herself. A long silence stretched between them, heavy and full of unspoken truths. Finally, Emily broke it. "I know things are slipping out of control," she said, her eyes fixed on the floor. "And I know we can't keep doing this." Jake felt a sharp pain in his chest. "Emily, I don't want to lose you." Emily turned to him, her eyes shimmering as if on the verge of tears. "Do you think I want that? Do you think I want to let go of the only thing that's made me feel like I'm not alone?" Jake took her hands in his eyes pleading. "Then don't. We can find a way. We can figure something out to keep it all. Keep you. Keep the family." Emily shook her head softly, a bittersweet smile playing on her lips. "Jake, this isn't just about us. It's about your dad, my mom, everything this family is built on. If they find out, do you really think they'll ever see us the same way again?" Jake didn't answer. He couldn't, because he knew the answer, and admitting it felt like stabbing himself in the heart. Emily gently pulled her hands free from his. She stood and moved to the window. She stared out into the black sky, where faint stars flickered like dying embers. "I've thought about this so much," Emily said, her voice breaking. "I've thought about all the ways we could make this work. But the more I think, the more I realize we can't. At least not now." Jake stood and walked to her, close enough to feel her presence, but not daring to touch her. "Emily, if you leave, I won't survive. I can't live without you." Emily turned to him, her eyes brimming with tears. "You can, Jake. You're stronger than you think. And one day, when all of this isn't so heavy, when we're not a burden to each other anymore, maybe then we'll find each other again." Jake shook his head, his voice breaking. "I don't want to wait. I want you now, here with me." Emily smiled, a sad but tender smile, and reached up to place her hand gently on his cheek. Her touch was warm, comforting, but it felt like a goodbye. "Jake, sometimes loving someone means letting them go. Not because you want to, but because it's the only way to keep both of you from falling apart." Jake looked at her, his eyes filled with desperation, but he said nothing, because deep down he knew she was right. The next day, Emily left. Her mother explained that she wanted to return to New York to continue her studies, to find her own path. No one in the family said much more about it, but Jake knew the truth. This was her way of protecting them both from complete ruin. He stood at his bedroom window, watching as the car pulled out of the driveway. Emily didn't look back and Jake didn't wave. Yet he felt something inside him break. Something vital slipping away that he wasn't sure he could ever recover. Weeks turned into months. Life gradually resumed its usual rhythm, or at least pretended to. But every time Jake passed the balcony where he had first heard Emily's guitar, he paused for a moment, as if waiting for something to return. Maybe Emily was right. Maybe one day when things were easier, they would find their way back to each other. But for now, Jake could only do the one thing he knew how to do. Keep moving forward, even though every step carried the weight of someone he could never forget. And somewhere, Jake knew that Emily, wherever she was, carried a piece of him with her forever.